There were 7 hours between New York and London, and Vera Caldecott had planned to spend them alone. She had been using Skyreach charter services for 3 years, 31 transatlantic routes, never once a shared cabin, which was both the point and what justified the billing. And she had confirmed this morning that the aircraft would be hers. And then she had boarded at Teterboro, and there was a man in seat 4A who had not been there when she approved the manifest. He was reading a water damage assessment report for a maintenance facility in Edinburgh. The cover said, Skyreach Maintenance Facilities, Edinburgh Hub, External Assessment 2024. She registered the Skyreach name without thinking about it, the way you register a brand you use and have stopped seeing. She would spend 7 hours in this aircraft with him. She would learn a great deal about him in those 7 hours. She would not learn the one thing that would have changed everything about how she spent those 7 hours. He owned the airline. Not the aircraft. The airline. Skyreach Charter Group, 23 aircraft across 3 continents, 12 years of operation, built from one plane and a line of credit against a first mortgage, without a single press release or investor pitch or profile in a business magazine. Because he had never agreed to one. He was in seat 4A because he rode his own aircraft incognito 3 times per year, checking the service from the inside, and this route had been on his list for 6 months. He was on the manifest as J. Holt, which was his middle name, which was what he used for these trips, and the operations team had not flagged the second passenger in the cabin, because to the operations team the second passenger was just another booking. He set the water damage report on his knee and looked out the portside window at the wing, and the morning light lay across the report in a long pale band, and he watched the number 3 flap for approximately 4 seconds before going back to reading. Aaron Holt had been in aviation for 25 years, which was one way to count it. Another way, he had been in aviation since the summer he turned 19 and took a job as a ramp agent at a regional airport in Ohio, because his father was a ramp agent, and his father said it was the best way to learn the industry from the bottom, which turned out to be true in ways his father had not entirely intended. His father, Edmund Holt, had been a ramp agent for 29 years at 3 airports, and had retired at 61, having never made it to flight crew, which had been his ambition since he was 12, and had watched a commercial aircraft cross a clear sky above his grandfather's farm, and decided he was going to be the one making that crossing someday. He had worked toward it for years, the certifications, the medical reviews, the applications that came back with polite language. He got older, the window narrowed, and eventually the ambition became something he carried instead of something he pursued. And he kept going to work on the ramp, because the ramp was where the aircraft were, and he still loved the aircraft. He died at 63, 2 years before Aaron bought the first Skyreach plane. He died knowing Aaron was saving toward something, not knowing what it would become. He left Aaron his logbook, a battered flight operations notebook he had kept since 1983, recording every aircraft registration number he'd worked, every weather condition, every departure time, because someone had told him when he started that if you want to understand something, you write it down. The logbook had entries in Edmund's hand from 1983 to 1991. Then a gap. Then Aaron's entries from 1998 to 2008, when the company got large enough that he switched to digital records and stopped keeping the book manually. He had given the logbook to Nora when she was 4, because she had found it and asked what all the numbers meant, and he had told her, and she had asked if she could write some too, and he had said yes. She had been writing in it since. She was 8 now. She had a section for cloud formations, and a section for tail numbers she saw at airports, and a section she called things that surprised me about the sky, which he had not prompted, and had not expected. The logbook now had 3 sections of handwriting in it. Edmund's faint ballpoint from the 1980s, Aaron's technical notations from the early 2000s, and Nora's careful capital letters that had been getting more cursive since she turned 7. It was the most complete family history Aaron owned, and it lived in his daughter's jacket pocket. This morning she had called him before his car reached Teterboro to report that she had seen a Cessna Citation at the local airfield with a tail number she recognized from Edmund's logbook, which she wanted to verify. He had told her to double-check the registration date. She had said she would. She had also said she was making grilled cheese for dinner, and was he going to be back in time, and he had said probably not tonight. And she had said okay, and hung up without drama. Because she was the kind of child who understood that some trips were necessary, and the grilled cheese would keep. The ticking clock was 72 hours. That was how long remained before Aaron needed to make a decision on the renewal of Skyreach's charter contract with Caldecott Capital, a contract worth $4.1 million annually, the largest single-client account in the New York hub. The renewal offer was on his desk. He had flagged this flight as part of his assessment. Vera Caldecott had submitted 7 formal complaints in 3 years: cabin temperature, beverage selection, a 20-minute delay due to a ground hold. 4 others he had read and found technically reasonable, but personally telling. He was trying to decide whether the account was worth the relationship, which was a different question from whether the account was profitable. He had been doing incognito assessments for 8 years. In that time, he had renewed every client who treated the aircraft with basic consideration and ended every contract with a client who treated the crew as furniture. The count was 6 ended, 41 renewed. He was still deciding where Caldecott Capital belonged. He had 72 hours to figure it out, and 7 hours of first-hand data coming, which was more than he usually got. 300 feet behind him in the Caldecott Capital boardroom, Vera's fund had completed an $800 million rebalancing of European positions by 11 a.m. that morning, and she had not felt anything particular about this. She felt things about mistakes. Correct decisions produced nothing, which she considered appropriate. She had been building Caldecott Capital for 14 years through a specific technique: control every information flow, never let anyone see the full picture, make every decision alone. It had worked. She managed $4.2 billion, and she managed it from a position of total informational asymmetry at all times. The thing this technique could not provide was someone who would tell her when she was wrong. She had not noticed this absence in a long time, which was its own kind of information. She had confirmed the empty cabin this morning. She had confirmed it again with the operations coordinator. She had boarded to find a man in 4A with a maintenance assessment report, and she had gone to her seat, 2C, the seat she always used, and she had not said anything yet, because she was composing the right thing to say in her head, which was a habit she had developed to avoid saying the wrong thing first. At 20 minutes into the flight, Vera said, "I need to document the operational reason for the seating change. My team confirmed an unoccupied cabin this morning, and I'll need that in writing for my billing records. If you have a connection to the charter's ground operations, I'd like it sent before we land." She said this in the tone she used for procedural communications: precise, impersonal, expecting compliance within a reasonable window. He said, "I'm a passenger." He went back to the water damage report. She went back to her screen. At 2:47 p.m., 47 minutes after takeoff, somewhere over the mid-Atlantic at 35,000 feet, Aaron lifted his head from the water damage assessment and said, "Port outflow valve is cycling about 400 feet per minute slow." You can feel it in the pressure on the climb. He said this to no one in particular, or to the aircraft, which in his experience was as reliable a listener as any. The flight attendant, who had been standing at the galley, and who had been aware for the past 20 minutes that something felt slightly off in the cabin pressure, and had not been able to identify it, stopped moving. She looked at him. He said, "Have the captain run a diagnostic on the outflow valve. Not urgent, it's well within tolerance, but worth logging before the next rotation." She went forward immediately. Vera had catalogued him by then, his hands calloused in the specific pattern of someone who works with tools rather than documents, his clothing unremarkable. A blue shirt and chinos, and a watch she didn't recognize. Aviation instrument, not a fashion piece. The water damage report on his knee, which was the kind of document that belonged to someone who owned the building being assessed, not someone inside it. She had filed him as competent in some operational field. She had not yet extended the file. She had also noted that he had not looked at her since she sat down, which was unusual. Most people in an unexpected shared cabin made a social calculation within the first 5 minutes. He had appeared to make none, or to have already made it before she arrived, which was a different kind of information. She said, "What did you just do?" It came out before she designed it. She heard herself ask, and recognized that it was not the question she had been composing in her head for 47 minutes, which had been something about scheduling irregularities and her operations team. This question was different. She waited. He said, flagged something for the crew. He looked back at the maintenance report. "It's not a problem. It just sounded like it wanted to be mentioned." She looked at the forward galley, where the flight attendant had disappeared. She looked at the report on his knee. She could see the Skyreach logo on the cover, and she registered it the way she registered the brand on the aircraft's tail. As a fact she already knew. Not a fact requiring examination. She wanted to return to her own screen. She had 8 hours of material to review for London. He had a maintenance report that clearly belonged to him and showed no sign of being set down. She did not return to her screen. Her question sat between them in the recycled air of the cabin at 35,000 feet, half answered, with the rest of it somewhere she could not quite see from seat 2C. He cracked her armor at roughly the 4-hour mark, and he did it without trying, which was the specific variety of crack that is the hardest to repair. She had asked, after an hour of them both working in their respective seats, whether he was familiar with the FBO inspection process, because the document on his knee had been face up for 4 hours, and she had absorbed more of it than she intended. He had said yes, fairly familiar. She had asked what the water damage was from. He had said, bad roof flashing over a 20-year period, compounded by a maintenance contractor who had been billing for repairs that weren't completed. She had said, "How do you identify that?" He had said, "You look at what the invoice says, and then you look at what's there." She had gone back to her screen after that, but she had not stopped thinking about you look at what the invoice says, and then you look at what's there. At the 5-hour mark, his phone lit up with a video call. He answered it. She was in the seat directly across the aisle, and the screen was visible. An 8-year-old appeared, in a kitchen, wearing a jacket with a rectangular bulge in the left pocket, tilting her head at the camera the way you tilt your head when you're trying to see something at a new angle. She said, "Dad, is the person next to you nice?" Aaron said, "We're on the same aircraft. It's a big aircraft." Nora tilted her head the other way. "Is she nice?" She said, very precisely. You can always tell by whether people look out the window or look at their phone. Vera was, at this exact moment, looking at her phone. She became aware of this. Aaron said, "She's been working." Nora looked at the camera in the way that meant she had already decided what she thought and was filing it as provisional. She held up the logbook. "I found 2 tail numbers from Grandpa's section at the airfield today. The Cessna and a Piper Cherokee. I cross-referenced the registration dates." She said this with the focused satisfaction of completing a task correctly. "They both check out." Aaron said, "Good work." Nora looked past the camera toward Vera, who was by now not looking at her phone. She said, "Do you know what's in a logbook?" Vera said, "Flight records." Nora looked pleased, in the way of someone whose provisional assessment has been revised upward. "It's everything," she said. "Where the aircraft has been, what the weather was, what the pilot was thinking. It's the whole story." She held it up to the camera so the cover was visible, worn, old, 3-generation leather. "This one starts in 1983. She said this with the reverence appropriate to a very old thing, before my dad was born." Vera said, "Before my dad was born." Her voice did something she hadn't told it to do. Nora considered this and wrote something in the logbook. She said, "I'm putting that down. Same year." Aaron watched the exchange without managing it. He did not prompt Nora or give Vera any social signal. He watched the way he watched everything, with the full attention of someone who has learned to read a situation by what it shows him, rather than what he's looking for. Vera straightened slightly and looked out the window, which was not the phone, and the wing was there below them catching the last of the Atlantic light. And Nora said she was going to go make grilled cheese, and she loved him, and goodbye. And the call ended, and the cabin was quiet. Vera did not look at her phone for the next 40 minutes. She looked out the window. Fletcher Vane was at the London FBO when they landed. He was dressed in a Skyreach ground crew vest and had his tablet and the particular manner of someone who has prepared a specific version of a specific conversation for a specific person. He saw Vera come down the aircraft stairs, and he crossed to her with the ease of someone who is good at smoothing over operational irregularities in person. He said to her, "Miss Caldecott, I wanted to personally follow up on the cabin sharing situation. There was a manifest error on the New York hub side, and I can assure you the service standards." He tapped 2 fingers on his own forearm. Tap, tap, the habit he had, the period he put at the end of every statement. "We'll be crediting your account for the inconvenience. I've already had the operations team." Aaron had come down the stairs behind Vera. He was standing 6 feet away. Fletcher saw him. His expression did something brief that he controlled quickly. He said, "Mister, I wasn't aware that you were on this route." He said this to Aaron, pleasantly, and then tap, tap on his forearm, and he looked at Vera and at Aaron and back at Vera. Aaron said, "Fletcher." 1 word. The tapping stopped. The Caldecott account was billed for 23 repositioning flights between March and October of this year, Aaron said. His voice was even. He was looking at his phone, at the billing summary that the operations analytics team had sent him during the flight. The one he had requested before departure as part of his client assessment, and had read twice on approach. The combined total is $340,000. The dispatch logs show 11 of those flights were never executed. The aircraft listed were either in scheduled maintenance or were dispatched to different routes. He looked up. The billing records are in the New York hub system. The dispatch logs are in the fleet management database. The discrepancy is in both. Fletcher's forearm was very still. "Wire fraud is a federal matter regardless of amount," Aaron said. "Billing for services not rendered to a client across state lines is the definition." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the aircraft on the tarmac behind them, reading the specific hang of the number 3 flap in the ground position, checking something he had been tracking since the port outflow issue. Fletcher stood there. His right hand came up toward his forearm. He did not tap. He put his hand in his pocket instead. He adjusted the vest. He turned and walked toward the FBO building at a pace that was several degrees more controlled than natural. He did not look back. He did not produce a parting statement. He became smaller as he walked, and then he was through the FBO door. And then he was gone, and the morning, late afternoon, London time, went on without him. Vera had not moved. She stood on the tarmac with the aircraft behind her and the FBO ahead of her, and the maintenance report man in front of her, and everything she had just heard sitting in the October air around her. And she said nothing for a long time. Because she had spent 14 years building a career on controlling information flows, and she had just watched a man she didn't know identify a fraud against her, account in the time it took to walk down an aircraft staircase. She said, "Who are you?" She called her chief financial officer from the FBO lounge at 4:49 p.m. She asked for the Caldecott Capital Charter account billing summary for the past 12 months, all invoices, all line items, specifically anything coded as repositioning fees. She asked for it in 20 minutes. He said he could do 15. He called back in 12. The invoices were there. The repositioning fees were there, 23 of them, billed across 8 months. Her CFO had a flag on 3 of them from his own review, charges for routes that didn't align with any Caldecott travel. He had been meaning to raise it. She had submitted a complaint about a beverage discrepancy in March. He had not sent the repositioning flag up the chain on the same week as the beverage complaint, because it had felt like the wrong moment. She went back to the lounge where Aaron was waiting, reading the water damage assessment again. She said, "Tell me who you are." He said, "Aaron Holt. I founded Skyreach Charter Group in 2012. I own it." He looked at the report. "I also have a facility in Edinburgh with a significant roof drainage problem that I've been trying to get around to addressing for 14 months, which is why I was reading this." She said, "You've been flying my routes for 3 years." He said, "Skyreach has. I've been on this specific route once. Tonight was the first time." He paused. "I was here to assess the client relationship." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "The contract renewal is on my desk. I had 72 hours to decide whether to renew. I was trying to understand the relationship before I made the decision." She said, 7 complaints. He said, 7 complaints. She said nothing. He said, "My father worked ramp for 29 years. He wanted to fly. The window got smaller every year. He died 2 years before I bought the first aircraft." He looked at the window of the FBO, where the aircraft was visible on the tarmac. "I built Skyreach so that the aircraft I fly are ones he would have been proud to work on. That's the standard. It doesn't always translate well into formal complaint channels." He looked at her. "I need clients who understand what they're using." She said, 7 complaints. He said, "Yes." She understood that she had him completely wrong from the first moment. The stranger in seat 4A with the maintenance report had not been a passenger. He had been the owner doing his job, on his aircraft, in his seat, reading about his roof. The chart she had been on for 3 years had been his aircraft for all 3 of those years, and she had been on it 31 times, and had looked at her phone and not the window, and had never asked who built the thing she was flying. She sat in the FBO lounge and looked at the aircraft on the tarmac, the one that had just carried her across the Atlantic and was now having its outflow valve logged for maintenance, because a man in seat 4A had mentioned it, and said nothing. And Aaron went back to reading, and outside the October light was flat on the London taxiway, and the number 3 flap was exactly where it should be. Fletcher Vane was terminated from Skyreach that evening. The billing records were submitted to federal law enforcement at 6:11 a.m. The following morning, when Aaron's legal team confirmed the complete scope, $340,000 across 8 months, 11 phantom routes. The Caldecott Capital account received a full credit and a documented audit of every invoice in the 3-year relationship. Vera Caldecott contacted Aaron Holt through the Skyreach main office at 9:14 a.m. to request a formal meeting. He agreed to 1 week from Thursday. She arrived at the Skyreach New York facility, the main maintenance hangar, which was where he worked when he was in New York, on a Thursday afternoon, which was not what she had expected. He showed her the fleet from the hangar floor. It was 11 aircraft on the New York side. He knew the registration number of every one and the maintenance history of each. She asked how he tracked it. He said, "The same way my father tracked his ramp log. You write it down." She said, "I want to renew the contract." He said, "I know." He looked at one of the aircraft, a midsize, the one that had been the second plane he'd ever bought. 14 years ago. "I've already renewed it. The terms are the same." He looked at her. "I need you to understand what you're using." She said, "I know." He held it 1 beat longer than it should have been, 1 beat longer. She held it back. Then from somewhere in the hangar, a voice, Nora, who had come with Aaron because it was a Thursday and school was out, calling from behind a support strut that she had found a tail number she needed help looking up. He said, "Coming." He went to his daughter. 1 year later. Nora sat in the Skyreach lounge at Teterboro with the logbook open to the cloud formation section, logging what she saw through the window. She was 9. She had added a new section to the logbook since last October. Aircraft I have been in. It had 3 entries. Aaron Holt had 24 aircraft and a renewed Edinburgh lease and an in-house billing audit protocol that had been running for 11 months without incident. The logbook his father had started in 1983 had been scanned and archived at Nora's request, so there would always be a backup. Edmund's entries were in the archive now, 48 years after he'd written them, still legible, still exactly what he had observed on that ramp in Ohio on those specific days. Vera Caldecott had flown Skyreach 14 times since October. She had submitted 0 complaints. She had asked on her 3rd flight if she could see the maintenance log for the aircraft she was boarding. The operations team had said yes, and had sent it, and she had read it before boarding. She had not been sure what to do with this habit when she first started it. Now it felt like the right thing. She was at Teterboro now. She was boarding in 20 minutes. Nora was at the window in the lounge, logging tail numbers. Vera came in and sat 2 chairs down and looked out the same window. Nora said, without looking up, "Do you know that one?" She pointed at a mid-size aircraft on the apron. Vera looked. She said, "N774SR." Nora wrote it down. She said, "That's the second one Dad ever bought. He knows every inch of it." She tilted her head at the aircraft the way she tilted her head at things she was deciding about. "He says every aircraft is a promise." Vera said nothing for a moment. She said, "I know." Nora wrote that down too, under the tail number, in the cloud formation section because there was space there. Vera looked at the page. She didn't ask what Nora had written. She looked out the window instead. And Aaron came in from the hangar side and saw them both at the window, and neither of them looked at him yet. They were both looking at the aircraft. And when Vera finally did look at him, and he looked back, the look lasted 1 beat longer than it needed to. And then Nora said, "The flaps look right today." And Aaron said, "They do." And they both looked at the aircraft, and the moment closed. A shared cabin at 37,000 feet is an equalizer. Money doesn't reach that high, but attention does. She boarded 31 times, believing the aircraft was hers because she paid for it. She left understanding that it belonged to the man in seat 4A who knew which valve was cycling slow, and whose father had written tail numbers in a logbook before she was born. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important information about what you're relying on is usually available. You just have to stop looking at your phone long enough to read the cover of what's right next to you. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments if you found out the person you'd been sharing 7 hours with owned the airline and had been deciding whether to keep you as a client the whole time. What would be the first thing you'd want to know about how he got there? We read every one.